There we are. Okay, now we are recording. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Well, that's right. Today's Halloween.
Happy
And-
Halloween.
Or I should say the eve of All Saints.
Yes, we're just,
The question was just asked about the previous two sessions recordings. And yes, I'm happy to say that Trish and I were able to figure out a way to get the recordings from this laptop onto the website. So if you go to the adult forum page at holytrinitynevadacity.org and scroll down to the bottom, she's added them as links underneath the links for the book and the outline for the course. And so now that we figured that out, it should be within 24 hours before today's is. And here's Barry joining us. Before today's is posted. It takes about, of course, I'm out in the boonies, but it takes about 45 minutes for the video file to upload. And at least out where I live in the boonies with not the fastest internet service. Hi, Barry. You're muted still.
Fix that. Okay, how's this?
There he is.
Good morning.
good morning.
I was just letting people know that Trish did figure out a way for the video files to get from this laptop onto the church website. So the previous two sessions are there. And this one should be within 24 hours or so, God willing. So with that, and I have two live bodies in the room here with me,
Right.
which means we're going to have to be a little bit more conscious about how I recognize people. So those of you who are on screen, please be patient. If you can't hear what the folks here in the room are saying, let me know. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do about it, but we'll try some things. Maybe if I move my machine or turn the volume up, I'm not quite so sure. But anyway, so this is a fun work in progress. So did you want one of these? Okay. Or what? Yeah, this is the,
Oh, this is online.
yeah, it's the, yeah, and this is slightly updated so that you can see the quotes. I'm talking about the outline. And last week, I made some very slight modifications to this, adding page numbers for these various quotes. And so if you've got an older one without those, you might want to go back to the church's website to that link and download this version. Aside from a couple of typos in the page numbers, there's no difference, however. So yeah, so let's dive into chapter 3, which is relatively brief.
Yeah, but
But as I was reviewing it, it seemed to me that Jung is expanding on his case made in the earlier two chapters about the dangers posed by modern society and mass-mindedness, and the ways in which religion, in the way he means that term, as we talked about last week, is a potential antidote. And I noted this is the first time where I, in my margin, made a reference to what we started to talk about last time, I think, briefly, was demythologizing. Does that term ring a bell to you guys? Or was I imagining that? Did I mention Bultmann and demythologizing? Okay. Yeah, because let me see if I can find, for those of you that are using the PDF version, which does not have the chapter or the paragraph numbers. Here we go. The top of the digital page 27 And if you've got that version, it'll be highlighted in yellow. Reader, for you, looking in the collected works, it's the second half, or it's in paragraph 521.
521. Okay. Oh, we're talking about the current chapter. I thought you were referring back before.
Yeah, no, this is chapter 3.
Yeah. I thought you were referring back to last week.
Mm.
Okay, 521, which where?
Right. The second paragraph, he says, the churches stand for traditional and collective convictions, which in the case of many of their adherents are no longer based on their own inner experience, but on unreflecting belief. So again, you recall the conversation we had last week where he is at pains to say, when he says religion is the sort of antidote to mass-mindedness, then he has to explain what he means by religion. And he means that personal experience, and he uses the term numinous, or the numinosum, which in turn is borrowed from Rudolf Otto, whose work on religious experience, the book which in English is mistranslated as The Idea of the Holy. And the original German is simply the Holy, das Heilige.
I have a funny anecdote about that. So I had to apply to Pacifica.
Yes.
They wanted me to answer the question about numinous, and I went, I have no idea. It's like I had to go searching around. Like,
Before?
I never heard that word before.
Yes. But that book was another one of the required readings in my class in comparative religion. So I'd already read the book, kind of went, huh? But that was a long time ago. Anyway.
Once you know it, it's a fabulous word, but when you don't know,
yeah.
I have to write a
getting back to
composition
this
about
quote,
this. Yeah.
He's again making this contrast between somebody who has had a personal experience of the holy versus somebody who has accepted the creedal statements and believes it intellectually without that sort of personal experience. And that was the danger he was beginning to point out in the previous chapter. It says, adherents are no longer based on their own inner experience, but on unreflecting belief. And here's the kicker, which is notoriously apt to disappear as soon as one begins thinking about it. Now, why would that be? The content of belief then comes into collision with knowledge, and it often turns out that the irrationality of the former, that is the belief, is no match for the ratiocinations of the latter. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience. And that's Jung's personal bias. You know something only when you have experienced it personally, yourself. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to consider that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place, which instilled, there's an untranslated Greek word, it is pistis, which is translated usually as faith, the content of belief. Something that happened to us in the first place, which instilled faith into us, that is trust and loyalty. This experience has a definite content that can be interpreted in terms of one or other of the denominational creeds. But the more this is so, the more the possibilities of these conflicts with knowledge mount up, which in themselves are quite pointless. That is to say, the standpoint of the creeds is archaic. They are full of impressive mythological symbolism, which if taken literally, comes into insufferable conflict with knowledge. Now, in the American context, one thinks of the conflict between so-called science and faith, creationism, evolutionism, fundamentalism, all of those things which arose in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And there's a fascinating book. Yes, if only I could remember the name of it. Oh, it's called Guaranteed Pure. And it is a history of the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And which gave rise to the term fundamentalism because of a series of tracts called The Fundamentals of the Faith. And so we have this conflict between those Christian sects that are what we would probably call biblical literalists. And we tend to differentiate those, the evangelicals, that group, from mainline Christianity. Those who look at the Bible more critically, all the kind of stuff that I was taught in seminary 45 years ago. Biblical criticism, literary criticism, the history of, the various translations and copies and the manuscript evidence and, what was in the Bible, old or new, and learning Greek and Hebrew and all that stuff. And they just say, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Simple, done. So again, Jung is contrasting that with, and then a thought that occurred to me as I was reflecting on this, how do we get religious experience? Can any of you think of a more recent within our lifetimes phenomenon of a sort of religious experience that sort of became a Christian fad back in the 70s and 80s?
Charismatic.
Thank you. Could you hear that?
I
That's
did.
right.
Oh, the charismatic movement.
Yes. Mike says the charismatic movement. Right, the speaking in tongues. So back 100 years ago or so, it was Pentecostalism. And then we re-experienced it again in the 70s in the charismatic movement, which swept through all kinds of churches, including our own. So is that the kind of direct religious experience that Jung is referring to? For many people, they would say yes. Okay, it is a powerful, can be a powerful, transformative personal experience, which is something different from intellectual acceptance of a creedal statement, or again, in the Protestant tradition, a confession of faith, like the Westminster Confession of the English Puritans 400 years ago. Anyway, the rest of this paragraph this is all worth sort of chewing on. But if, for instance, the statement that Christ rose from the dead is to be understood not literally, but symbolically, then it is capable of various interpretations that do not conflict with knowledge and do not impair the meaning of the statement. The objection that understanding it symbolically puts an end to the Christian's hope of immortality is invalid, because long before the coming of Christianity, mankind believed in a life after death, and therefore had no need of the Easter event as a guarantee of immortality. The danger that a mythology understood too literally and is taught by the church will suddenly be repudiated lock, stock, and barrel is today greater than ever. Is it not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood symbolically for once? And that is exactly the argument that Rudolf Bultmann made back in the 60s in his book about demythologizing Christianity, which was a whole, at the time, a whole new way of looking at scripture and the stories of miracles and the resurrection itself. Interestingly enough, just this past week, I had a patient come in and ask me, sort of off the topic of therapy, but she's a devout Roman Catholic, if I'd ever heard of a guy named Spong. Mike's laughing. Yes, John Shelby Spong, the infamous Bishop of Newark, who was roundly condemned for proposing exactly what Jung is talking about here, because her sister had heard an interview with him and was intrigued by his ideas and was wanting to read his books, but she wanted to get my opinion first because she knows I'm a priest as well as a psychologist. So I said, go ahead. And then gave a little context about mythologizing, and that, yes, he was pretty controversial in his day for some people, but not for everybody. So the question that Jung is raising, and it's interesting that it's now almost 70 years ago, but is still very much with us today, is how do we understand this thing that we call faith? Does it simply mean getting up and reciting the Nicene Creed at Mass every Sunday? And do we believe everything in the creed? I don't know. I mean, and I'm willing to put this out there, but I'm not a apocalyptic eschatologist. I don't think the writer of John's Gospel was either. But it's there in the creed, and he shall come again in power and glory to judge the living and the dead. I think he did. We call it Easter. So I'm not waiting for a second coming. It already happened. Now, that's my humble opinion. And somebody wants to talk about it or argue about it, I'm happy to do that anytime. But that's just one example. Thoughts, reactions from either you guys here or you guys here? Yes, Sandy.
I think, I don't know the exact wording, but I think I was reading one of the Jung books and he had a client who was thinking of changing religions or had changed religions and was having trouble psychologically. And Jung had suggested that she go back to the religion that she was brought up in.
Yes.
And my thinking is, when I read a lot of all different philosophies around religion, and so there's there's the literal understandings of the Bible, and then there's symbolic understandings. And so once I've read it, it's like I can't get it out of my head. And so I can't say I'm 100% this belief on a particular topic and 100% this, 100% that. It's like I'm an amalgamation of everything. So it's all in there in me.
Yeah.
And so it's easy for me to understand a lot of different viewpoints because it's like I'm just holding them all inside myself.
Well, yeah, I can't remember which writing that is, but I remember that story, and I remember it having an impact on me as I was an undergrad studying comparative religion. And one of the things Jung says is that he proposes at one point that the unconscious itself is kind of layered. You have a personal unconscious, then you have a cultural layer, and then you have the deepest layer, what he called the collective. And so if you're raised and born into Western European, more or less Judeo-Christian culture, can you really become a Hindu?
Mm.
That's interesting.
If you're not culturally Indian, or a Buddhist, if you're not, other Asian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. And he suggests you can do it on an intellectual level, but there's a disconnect with that cultural and unconscious. And so I had the kind of same experience. I just said, while there are a lot of those concepts that I appreciated as I studied other major world religions, I said, that's not me. I am culturally ethnically, genetically. And that was before I knew I was half French.
I'm sorry, before you were.
Before I knew I was half French. That my real biological father was pure Quebecois. I didn't know that when I was an undergrad. That was years later. But certainly my roots are virtually 100% Western European. And so Christianity makes sense to me. I can appreciate those other faiths. And then again, there's the contrast between, as you were saying, Sandy, is sort of the creedal statements and the doctrines and dogmas that go along with all of the major world religions. And then within each of them, there is a mystical tradition. You know, so in Judaism, it's Zohar, and in Christianity, it's mystical monasticism, like Nicholas of Cusa and others in the late Middle Ages. Within Islam, it's Sufism. And when you start comparing those, it gets down to the personal experience of the divine is described universally. It doesn't matter what tradition you're from. When they talk about what happens to them when they have that moment, the descriptions are identical. And Jung would say, well, that's because we all have the same brain structure. We all share the same collective unconscious. And on that level, it doesn't matter whether you're Indian or Asian or European or African or indigenous or whatever. That's the strata in which all human beings are the same. Mike has a comment.
Back to Boltman, I think it was in
The demythologizing? Yeah, that was a good one.
why do we have to make a choice between seeing all religion as symbolic and which kind of takes away the reality of it in a sense?
Well, he would disagree with that
Okay,
either or,
well, right.
because we live in an increasingly scientific and technological society
Right.
where explaining
Right.
miracles, resurrections, all of those sorts of assertions, if you take them literally, become increasingly difficult to either accept or explain.
Scientific.
Yeah, scientifically.
Scientifically.
In other words, it's like, as we were saying, the fundamentalist movement
Right.
was a reaction to a perceived threat
Right.
in the growth of scientific rationalism, which back in the mid 19th century was posed by Darwin's theory of evolution,
But
which
yeah,
was
but-
seen
but-
as conflicting with the biblical creation narrative.
But that's because you're comparing the two and they're not necessarily comparable, I think.
Say more about how that, can you guys hear him?
Yes, speak up, Mike, but I can hear you.
Yeah, it's a little bit louder
Okay,
so they can,
So, yeah, so I kind of see that as a false comparison. And unfortunately, that's what the church and science have been, going back and forth over for centuries or more. And, but I don't even know if that comparison is real. I mean, it's not. And the other thing about the symbolism versus, what was the word we were using, versus, I think that was from Boltman.
well, he said here, Jung says, if, for instance, the statement, the Christ from the dead is to be understood not literally,
Right.
but symbolically. So again, it's a literal acceptance of versus a symbolical understanding of.
But if the resurrection actually happened, and which I believe, I believe in all the miracles. I've seen miracles. So I have no. For me, it's scientifically true because I've experienced it. So I don't understand why there should be an either or, where both are true. I don't reject the symbolic way of looking at it, perhaps as the demythologizing way, because that's the way our minds work, not necessarily our spirit. Maybe it's a different. Hard to explain. I'm sorry.
It is hard to explain.
All I'm doing is saying I just reject the either or.
Okay, so you see it as a both and.
A both and,
where Jung is phrasing it as an either or.
right?
Okay. Yeah, Barry?
Okay, well, here I come. I'm saying it's neither.
Oh, it's,
Okay, so
Barry says it's
It's
instead of
neither.
either or, it's
Yeah.
neither nor.
yeah, okay, so here we go.
All
So
right.
to me, it's not literal. The resurrection, I wasn't there, and in the absence of some, really good evidence, I
mean, you're not 2,000 years old?
Yeah. On the other hand, I don't like the word symbolic because for me, it just begs the question, symbolic of what? I don't want to answer that question. I just want to live with the resurrection, live with it as a story or as just something that's there, but is not necessarily symbolic of me or somebody else going on a chariot ride up to heaven or something. I don't see the need to assign a specific symbolic meaning to a story that's powerful in and of itself. Rita's got an answer for me.
Okay.
Well,
Rita, before you start, were you done, Barry?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. Rita?
I think it has of how one interprets symbolism or myths as not quite true. This was a kind of an interesting part when I got into Jungian psychology. The myths and the fairy tales are, and even dreams are actually, in a way, more true than the outer world. Just because it's a symbol or a myth doesn't mean it's not true. A symbol holds much more than actually an outer item or so. I didn't explain that right, David, but you know what I mean.
Well, I think you're talking about archetypal symbols.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm with you. To me, it's
Because
like
it's a myth doesn't mean it's not true. It's
Exactly.
true on a different level.
right.
Does that help you? Yeah. Mike is nodding, that helps him.
Okay,
In other words, you may not have to accept literally that God made the world in 6 days and then took a break. But that's not really at conflict with the deeper meaning that everything that is grounded in God. He is, as one of those other famous German theologians said, the ground of being. And I'm quoting Paul Tillich, by the way.
I also had a question. Does it have anything to do with typology? Do they have anywhere, say somebody that is more sensate would have a different take on this than somebody that's more intuitive? Like just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's actually tried to do a correlational study, but I think it sort of has face validity. You would think somebody who is more externally sensory oriented would have an easier time with a more scientific attitude, where somebody who's more artistic, more intuitive, more interior oriented is more willing to go with their gut and they do what feels right because it just feels right.
Now they use the word, you use the word feel, which is still different.
Right.
Intuitive is different than feeling. So
Yeah.
you'd have
Yeah,
the
well,
feeling
see,
and
I'm
the
a thinker,
thinking.
so I contrast thinking and feeling.
Yeah. But there's the intuitive sensate. So
Yeah, that's the other pair.
you can't quite put your finger on intuitive, but it's,
Yeah.
and that's what Jung was supposedly was, intuitive first, intuitive thinking. Introvert intuitive thinking.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me. Now, in the very next paragraph, Jung uses a popular German term.
Excuse me, what number, what paragraph number?
Oh, yeah.
It's 522. It's the paragraph after the one that we were just quoting from, where he talks about literal versus symbolic. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands what Weltanschauung means. It's a German word, which he uses in the paragraph after that as well, but it's not translated. So, sort of like for those of you who are Trevor Noah fans, if you don't know, now you know. Weltanschauung, roughly translated, means worldview. The attitude towards the world. So in this sentence, he says, besides which, the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc, as I have explained above. Next page over, the next paragraph, in fact, where again, he's contrasting West versus East. So think the liberal democracies of Western Europe and America versus the communist bloc, the Soviet Union. Let's see. He loves to make long sentences. So I'm trying to think. Let's see, it would not be surprising, let's see, we accuse the Germans of having forgotten it all again already. But the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar, he means like the Nazi takeover, something similar might not happen elsewhere. It would not be surprising if it did. And if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided idea. We permit ourselves the question, which countries have the biggest communist parties? America, which, untranslated Latin, means biggest changer of all, forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted. But in point of fact, she is perhaps even more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific, here's this German word again, Weltanschauung, or worldview, with its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. He's pointing out we're such a young country, we don't have those deep cultural roots like the European countries. The historical and humanistic type of education so sorely needed in such circumstances leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella experience. Though Europe possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoisms and paralyzing skepticism. Common to both is the materialistic and collectivist goal, and both lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely, an idea which puts, and here's his real issue, the individual human being in the center as the measure of all things.
Which is very Christian.
So again, yeah, Jung is highly skeptical of groups, parties, blocks, nationalism, because he sees it as essentially a dumbing down. And that the only really salvation or counterbalance is an individual who is sufficiently grounded in him or herself to resist getting caught up in the mass. And think of any cult. Again, when I was the seminarian in Berkeley, the People's Temple, Jim Jones cult happened. And the mass suicide in Guyana. I mean, that was powerful. That was powerful. So we've seen this over and over and over and over again. It's not new.
Just address what I believe is the reason these things happen. It's called the incredible need for man to belong.
Say it
Um,
again, Mike?
yes and no. Could you hear his question?
No.
Say it again, Mike, a little louder.
I was wondering if Young addresses the reason why these cults happen. To me, it is because of the need mankind has, a great need. I think even more than water, food, is the need to belong.
Mhm.
Which, even though, yes, as Jung says, we need to have a sense of ourselves that to resist that kind of being caught up into something that's really awful. But at the same time, we also have this desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And it's a real need to belong.
Which is the attraction
Which is the attraction, right?
of
But-
getting caught up in the group.
But the Lionel Corbett, who's a Jungian who talks about the religious function of the psyche,
Mhm.
he's talking this need to belong goes back to basically object relations, where if you had the good mother and father and you could internalize it, then you're able to internalize a really good God and have that part of your psyche, part of your world. So you don't have to go looking for an outside God figure, like a communist figure or a cult figure, because you've had it inside you. Does that make sense, David?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Lionel was one of my favorite teachers. And he wrote that book actually after I had finished and sent me an early copy and asked for a review.
Oh, nice.
And out of that notion has developed what is now called attachment theory,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Gilligan's work about secure attachment versus insecure attachment, and which, as Rita said, is speculated to be based on the infant's very early experience of whether or not there was a reliable caregiver, whether or not their needs were met or not. And this forms in the root of the person a sense of whether or not the world is a trusting place or a non-trustworthy place, which is similar to Erickson's initial first stage of human development, which he calls basic trust versus mistrust. Either because the human infant is the most helpless for the longest period of time of any species on the planet, right? Which, and historical anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists say that's why we developed as a social animal. Right? Because without it, our species would not have survived. Moms had to be so involved in the care of the infant that both would have starved if there wasn't somebody else around to feed them, because mom couldn't go do all the work to feed herself because she's caring for this infant. So the notion that we started with the nuclear family and then a clan and then a tribe is all rooted in that primary experience. But flip forward several millennia and think about some of the social problems we deal with today. The bills being debated in Congress right now, for example, to address child poverty, family stability, early intervention. We're either going to pay for it up front, social psychologists would argue, or we're going to pay for it down the line with a very expensive criminal justice system. We're going to pay for it one way or the other. So is an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure? Or are we going to be penny wise and pound foolish? That's really, again, folks, from our disciplines, that's really the choice we have. We're going to pay for it. No question. We're either going to pay for it up front and solve the problem while it's solvable, or we're going to pay for it down the line. by building more prisons, hiring more cops, having more judges, having all of that. And we've been doing the latter for the last 50 years. And so Dr. Phil's famous question, how's that been working for you? And if it ain't been working so good, maybe it's time to think of a different approach.
And we can't just say they need Jesus.
No, no. Yes, they do. I mean, and I'm speaking to
No,
somebody,
but we
I
can't.
used to work in a maximum security prison
Yeah, right.
in the Arizona desert. And no, they didn't spend money on air conditioning
Wow.
for cell blocks when it was 118 degrees outside. It was not pleasant.
But it's it's so easy to see why people can fall into these charismatic leaders. I mean, if you look at the formulas, and this is where we're going to, because during the elections, was it this year or was it with Hillary and Trump, or was it with Trump and Biden? PBS kept showing Rick Steves' rise of fascism, both in Germany and in Italy with Mussolini. And you see the factors there. They're just looking for that father. They're just looking for somebody to kind of just take care of them.
Well, they want a hero. And,
Yeah.
and we know that, again, the hero is an archetypal figure. And some of you may have read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I mean, hero mythology, hero stories are ubiquitous all around the world, which again is part of the support for Jung's theory of these universal archetypal, deeply bedded in the unconscious kind of figures, because these themes repeat all across cultures and across eras. I mean, the movies that we go see today,
Mhm.
they're hero stories.
It's so true. It's so obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether it's, a Marvel
Yeah.
comic figure brought to life, or whether it's,
The Japanese animes,
yes.
all of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was watching Toy Story the other day. I'm crying for an animated Toy Story because Woody's the hero. It's like
Yes, the hero, the anti-hero.
It's interesting because the Bible really doesn't have any of those kinds of heroes. They're all,
Oh, really?
well, they're all,
I think
they're all,
I think it has a major hero.
that guy named Moses.
but he was so flawed. I mean, he didn't get to go into the promised land. He was rebuked at the end.
Yeah.
David was a hero,
I mean,
and
and
he
you
was
do
also
see that in
flawed.
some-
All right. Sandy, say that again.
King David was a hero, but he was also flawed.
Yes.
But the book, I mean, the movie about David and Moses, we're going to call it the Bible. The movie is very like, no, he's not really a hero.
Yeah. And do you have any idea why that might be a sort of cantus firmus running through the Bible?
I think because it's based on reality. It's how life really is.
Well, that's part of it. Think specifically of the story in 1 Samuel when the Israelites ask for a king.
Well,
They say, we want to be like all the other
right, nations.
countries around us. We want a king. And what is,
Salt.
through Samuel, what is God's response?
You want it? You got it.
Well, before that,
Oh, right.
before that, he says, who really is their king?
Right.
You know what's gonna happen.
Yeah,
You know it's gonna happen.
What'll happen if I let you have a king.
that's right. Right. Well, the point is, their hero is supposed to be God.
Right.
So, and again, this gets back to this human failing.
So is that built
We
into
can't
us?
see God. We can't talk to God directly. Now, maybe Samuel can. So should we make Samuel our king? Samuel says, oh, no way. I'm not falling for that trap. We want something that we can see, touch, hear, because that's wait for it, a direct experience. We want a direct experience.
But we also
We're
have
never
to-
satisfied. Think about the grumbling of the Israelites in the wilderness. We're sick of manna.
We want a direct
Blech.
experience, but that kind of precludes faith, which is all about our relationship with God.
Okay, where was that quote? Yes, paragraph 521. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to consider that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place, which instilled that faith into us.
Mhm.
That, it's
So-
that the faith is sort of the afterglow of something that really did happen.
Thank you. Did you all hear that?
It's worth repeating.
Say it again, Mike, a little louder.
That faith is the afterglow of something that really did happen.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Well put.
Well done.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, through all of this, Jung's focus is on the importance of the individual and the individual's experience, which allows that individual to resist the temptation to be caught up in the hero worship and mass-mindedness of either state religion on the one hand,
Mhm.
as he's looking at, again, the Soviet bloc, or religious faith that is accepted in the head, but not the heart, because he was raised in that kind of a religion. His father was a
Yeah.
Swiss Reformed pastor, which was sterile and
Brutal.
dry and lacking in that sort of direct experience. And again, the American antidote to that was the Pentecostal movement. And a century before that, the Great Awakenings, the revival meetings of the early 1800s. Okay, those provided that kind of personal experience. And, you know, those of us who are of a certain age can remember Billy Graham,
Oh, yeah.
you know, which was the third Great Awakening. It's an old model from the late 1700s, early 1800s, just instead of under a great big tent, it's in a stadium, but it's the same phenomenon. Come on forward and be saved. You know, again, that's a personal experience, which provides the kernel, sort of the core of that personal transformation. So in getting back to Mike's earlier question about what it is that makes the person susceptible to getting subsumed into that, I have a hunch that the very next chapter is going to address your question.
Mm.
So I don't want to get into it too much today, except to say when he talks about in chapter 4, the individual's understanding of himself is where we're going to chew on that. So yeah, this was a short chapter, but there's a lot of stuff in it. I mean, virtually every paragraph you could chew on for an hour. Yeah, Barry.
Yeah, I just have a question for you folks that know more about this than me. Can a hero not be flawed? For example, David had his flaw, Achilles had his heel, but they're still heroes. And
Yeah.
to me,
That's the again, the universal and kind of enduring element of hero stories. I mean, for the Hindus, it's Prince Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a section of the larger Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. And the Gita, he's arguing with his chariot driver, who is an incarnation of Krishna, who's explaining to him on the eve of this great battle why he should do his duty. But the fact that the hero is having doubts about it is, again, that's sort of a heroic flaw. For David, it was his affair with his neighbor woman, Uriah's wife. And for Moses, it was doubting God in a crucial moment, which is why he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land. He could see it, but not set foot in it. really the only biblical character who is without a flaw is who?
Joseph.
Jesus,
No, not Joseph.
Jesus,
Take a look. Thank you. Say it again louder, Barry.
Jesus.
Jesus. Right.
But he had, okay. But when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, he does have doubts. Or he says, please take this away from me. I don't know if you'd see that as a flaw, but
Yeah, that's not really a doubt. That's a, I know where I got to go. I don't really like it.
okay.
I wish there was another way, but of course, at the end, he says, okay.
Yeah.
Not my will, but thy will be done.
So if the heroes are not flawed, then it puts him in a God state. And I think maybe that's the difference why heroes have to have a little human flaw to them so they don't become gods.
Right, right. And of course, we get around that nowadays by making them superheroes,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Starting with Superman back in the 50s,
Right.
the original TV version, and now the Marvel superhero universe.
But Superman had his flaw. It was kryptonite.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So the original Superman stays true to the flawed hero motif. So, well, listen, guys, I'm looking at the clock and it's about time for us. So thank you very much, both in person and online, for being here. Again, God willing, this will be posted on the website within 24 hours or so, and thereafter, now that we've figured out how to make that happen. So thank you, and we'll see you same time next week, and we'll discuss chapter 4. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you very much. This is a great show.
Bye, everybody.
Guys, bye.
Bye.
Bye.